We're going to take a moment here and take a look at a piece by Mozart. This is from his Sonata KV 331, and it is a tema. In other words, it's a theme. He's going to use this theme in this movement as a basis for a set of variations. But we're going to just take a look at the first 8 or 9 measures and try to find some inversions. First thing we want to notice is that from the beginning of the music up until the double bar, the repeat sign, there are 8 measures. And those 8 measures are divided into 2 separate phrases. There's the first phrase, measure 1 through 4, and the second phrase, measure 5 through 8. I can see that with a sort of cessation of the rhythm. Look at the bass in measure 4. It ends on a dotted quarter note, so that really brings the music to a bit of a halt moving forward. And then you can see that again in measure 8. We can see the phrase resulting on a quarter note on the tonic triad and then an 8th note rest. And the double bar really does give us a good hint in terms of the end of the phrase at that point. So let's take a look at the beginning. We should actually make a chart of all of the chords in the key of A, and that will help us to analyze. So let's go ahead and do that. Also, for at least the first 4 measures, it may help to actually simplify the notes a little bit. And in simplifying, we'll take some of the decorative pitches away so that we can see the chords a little bit easier. So that's what this other diagram is showing you. Notice in the first measure, we've actually taken away in the bass the A, which moved to B and then back to A. That's called a neighbor tone. Whenever you have a non-chord tone, that's a tone that does not fit in the chord, but it's approached by a step, and then it reverses direction and goes back to the original note, and we call that a neighbor tone. So we're not going to consider that as part of the chord. The first chord is simply A, C sharp, E. And as you can see from the chart, that's just a 1 chord. And that's in root position. Take a look at the second half of the measure and you'll see that the bass moves up to C sharp. Now the notes that we see there at that moment are C sharp and E. We could analyze that in 2 ways. We could say, well, those are 2 notes of the 3 chord. But I think that the A is so strong at the beginning of this piece that you'll still be kind of hearing it as you hear the second half of this measure. So I would venture to say that the second half of this measure is still the 1 chord, but the bass has moved up to the 3rd, so the effect will be first inversion. That gives actually a nice little variety in the bass line. It makes the bass line quite melodic. The second measure, we're going to just look again. The neighbor tones have been removed in this little diagram, and we see the pitches E, G sharp, and B. Take a look at the chart. You'll see that's the 5 chord, but the G sharp is in the bass. That's the third. Remember, when you put a third in the bass, that's first inversion, so we'll label that as 5, 6. Why the inversion here? Well, compare the beginning of this measure with the beginning of the first measure, and you'll see that the A, which was very strong at the very beginning of the piece, gets to go to this G sharp, which is very strong at the beginning of the second measure. So the bass, in effect, at least in a structural way, dropped down a half step. It is the inversion of this 5 chord that allows that very strong and actually rather simple motion to take place in the bass line. If you look at the second half of that second measure, the bass actually moves up to the B, which is the 5th of the chord, meaning that the chord actually becomes a second inversion chord. Now, it's a little bit complicated by the fact that the melody goes up to the pitch D, and the pitch D is actually the 7th chord tone. We'll take that up in a later chapter. We'll talk about 7th chords. At this point, I would like to move a little bit further along. Let's move toward the cadence. This is measure 3, the second chord. We see a return of the E, G sharp, B. That's the 5 chord again. And we see the G sharp in the bass, so that's in first inversion. Moving into the fourth measure, we see the A, C sharp, E, which is just the 1 chord. See how nice that first inversion 5 chord voice leads into the 1 chord. By placing the G sharp in the bass, it gets to move up just a half step into the 1 chord. That's really nice bass motion that's only possible with inversions. And then we're going to move right to the end of measure 4. I know we're skipping around a little bit, but we just want to get to some of the things that interest us at this moment. And we see a 1 chord, A, C sharp, E, but the E is in the bass. The E, of course, is the 5th of the chord, so that's a second inversion chord. Whenever you see a second inversion chord, you want to ask yourself the question, what kind of second inversion chord is it? You should never see a second inversion chord unless you can label it. And as you know, the types that we have are cadential 6/4, arpeggiating 6/4, the pedal 6/4, and the passing 6/4. Now, we already determined that this was a cadence, so it's probably a cadential 6/4 chord. And look at what happens. The upper 2 pitches, the A and the C sharp, move to G sharp and B. And if you combine those with a bass note, that's a 5 chord. So in effect, what we have here is a strong 5 chord at the cadence, which is a half cadence. But it's the cadential 6/4 formula, 1/6/4 going to 5 at a cadence. The next phrase, beginning in measure 5, is rather parallel to the first phrase. In other words, it's pretty much the same music. Until you get to measure 8, it changes a little bit. Let's look at measure 8. The first is a 1 chord, A, C sharp, E. But the E is in the bass. That makes that chord again in second inversion. Notice again, we are at a cadence. And it is a good place for a cadential 6/4 chord. As you might recall, the cadential 6/4 chords usually occur on strong beats. And here, certainly that chord is on a strong beat. It's on the very first chord of the measure. Now, a cadential 6/4 chord, of course, the function is dominant, and that comes about by the bass pitch, which is E, the 5th of the chord. Notice that that pitch here has been doubled. There are 2 E's. That's exactly the doubling that we learned should happen on a 6/4 chord. And it moves to a 5 chord, that 8th note that comes next, E, G sharp, B. Now there's another extra note there. That's the D. Again, we're saying that's the 7th of the chord. And at this point, you'll just have to sort of accept that that's the chord 7th that we'll have to learn in a chapter in a few weeks. Now remember, with a cadential 6/4 chord, the bass pitch going from the 1/6/4 to the 5 chord should stay the same. And it really does. The E stays on E. But as we talked about, sometimes the E will drop an octave. That's a really nice sound for a cadence. And then the very last chord is the 1 chord. So what kind of cadence is this? Especially compared to that first cadence we saw that ended on the 5 chord, this one is a final cadence. 5, or dominant, going to 1, tonic, that's an authentic cadence. This, therefore, is a perfect authentic cadence that balances the half cadence we saw in measure 4. There's a name for this. When you have two cadences that are sort of paired like these are, and the first one is a half cadence, and the second one is an authentic cadence, we call this antecedent consequent, or question-answer phrases. It's very common in music. Let's push forward a little bit. This is measure 9. Look at just the left-hand part here. It's A, C sharp, E. That's the 1 chord. The next is D, F sharp, A. Look at the chart. That's the 4 chord. But notice that the first note of that little grouping is A. So the effect is that chord has the 5th as the lowest pitch. So we've got a 6/4 chord. It's a 4/6/4. So the question always is, what kind of 6/4 chord is it? Is it cadential? Is it arpeggiating? Is it passing? Or is it pedal? I think we'll get the clue to what kind it is if we look at the very next measure. Notice that the chord is still on the 4 chord, the D, F sharp, A, with A still on the bass. And then the following chord is back to the tonic, A, C sharp, E. And look at the first note in each grouping, going back to measure 9 in the left-hand part. A, 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 A. Do you remember what you call that when in the bass you keep having a persistent note even though the chords are changing? Hopefully you remember that's a pedal tone. So by putting that 4 chord in second inversion, the composer was able to create the exact same bass pitch, the lowest pitch, consistently over 2 measures, creating a pedal tone. So the best explanation for that chord, that 4/6/4, is a pedal 6/4.